Here's a compelling introduction for your motivational speech. The room was filled with the hum of quiet conversations, the kind that fade into the background when someone truly worth listening to takes the stage. The energy in the air was almost electric, not because of loud cheers or applause, but because of anticipation. People leaned forward in their seats, eyes locked on the man about to speak. He wasn't the loudest person in the room, nor did he demand attention with grand gestures. Yet, somehow, he had everyone's focus. Simon Sinek took a deep breath, looked around, and smiled. He knew exactly why these people were here. Some were searching for answers, others for direction, and a few simply wanted reassurance that they were on the right path. What he was about to share wasn't a secret formula or a shortcut to success. It was something far more powerful, something that had been right in front of them all along. "The world moves fast," he began, his voice steady but inviting. "We're told that if we don't speak up, if we don't push harder, if we don't make noise, we'll be left behind. But what if I told you that sometimes the greatest strength comes from silence?" A ripple of curiosity passed through the audience. Silence. How could staying quiet lead to success? Wasn't it the bold, the loud, the outspoken who won in life? It was a question nearly everyone had asked themselves at some point. Simon leaned in slightly, lowering his voice just enough that the audience instinctively leaned in too. Think about the moments in your life that truly mattered. The room fell even quieter. He had their full attention now. He continued, "We live in a time where everyone wants to be heard, but few want to listen. We feel pressured to prove ourselves with words, to constantly share our thoughts, to always have something to say. But real power, real influence, comes not from speaking, but from observing, from understanding, from allowing the right things to come to you, rather than chasing after everything at once." A young woman in the front row nodded slightly, as if his words had struck a chord. A man in the back, who had entered the room with arms crossed and skepticism written on his face, now seemed to be reconsidering something deep within himself. Simon let a few seconds of silence stretch between his words, reinforcing his point without needing to say anything at all. Then, with a knowing smile, he asked, "What if the very thing you've been chasing, the success, the clarity, the breakthrough, was always meant to find you? What if, instead of shouting over the noise, you simply stayed still, listened, and let it come naturally?" The question hung in the air, unanswered. The audience felt it, the shift in perspective, the weight of realization. And just like that, they were ready to hear more. The room remained still, as if everyone was holding their breath, waiting for what would come next. Simon's words had already planted a seed, a thought that challenged everything they had been taught about success, ambition, and control. People had spent years, maybe even their whole lives, believing that if they weren't actively chasing something, it would never come. And yet, here he was saying the opposite, that sometimes the best thing you can do is stay silent and let things unfold naturally. Simon took his time, letting the silence settle before he spoke again. "I want you to think about the most successful people in the world, the ones who inspire you, the ones who seem to have it all figured out. Do you think they got where they are by constantly forcing things to happen? Or did they recognize when to be still, when to wait, and when to let the right opportunities find them?" A few heads nodded in agreement, while others looked deep in thought, reflecting on what he had just said. He could see it in their eyes. Some were skeptical, others intrigued. That was good. It meant they were listening. He shifted slightly, his voice steady but full of emotion. "I learned this the hard way," he admitted. "For years, I thought that if I wasn't always talking, always proving myself, I'd be forgotten. I chased opportunities, I fought for recognition, I tried to control every outcome. And you know what happened?" He paused for effect. "I lost myself in the noise." A quiet murmur moved through the audience, as if his words had hit close to home for more than a few of them. Simon continued, his eyes scanning the crowd. "There was a time when I was constantly exhausted, constantly anxious. I was afraid that if I slowed down, I'd fall behind. That if I wasn't speaking up in every meeting, If I wasn't always the loudest voice in the room, I would be invisible. And then one day, I met someone who changed everything. He let that thought linger, building curiosity. People leaned in slightly, eager to know more. She was a leader, one of the most respected people in her field. But what struck me the most about her wasn't how much she talked, it was how much she listened. She had this quiet confidence, this way of making people feel seen without saying much at all. And the more I watched her, the more I realized that her power didn't come from forcing things to happen. It came from understanding the right moments to act and the right moments to wait. A man in the middle row shifted in his seat, his expression changing. Maybe he had known someone like that. Maybe he had felt the same exhaustion from always trying to control everything. Simon let a small smile cross his face. That's when it clicked. I had been so busy trying to make things happen that I never gave anything the chance to come to me. I was speaking so much that I forgot to listen. And the moment I changed that, the moment I stepped back, embraced silence, and allowed space for things to unfold, I started seeing everything differently. I started noticing the right opportunities instead of chasing the wrong ones. I started truly hearing people instead of waiting for my turn to speak. And slowly, everything I had been running after started coming to me instead. He took another brief pause, watching as the weight of his words settled in. Some people looked deep in thought, others seemed almost relieved. It was as if they were realizing, for the first time, that they didn't have to constantly fight for control. Simon adjusted his stance, his voice calm but firm. We've been conditioned to believe that success belongs to the loudest, to the ones who demand attention. But the truth is, the greatest leaders, the ones who truly make an impact, understand the power of patience, of observation, of timing. They don't waste energy trying to force things that aren't meant for them. Instead, they focus on being present, on understanding, on preparing themselves so that when the right moment comes, they're ready. A woman in the back let out a slow breath, as if she had just let go of something heavy. The room still held that quiet tension, the kind that comes when people are realizing something important. Simon met their eyes, one by one, letting his words sink in. So I ask you this, what would happen if you stopped chasing for a moment? If you stopped trying to control every little detail and instead trusted that what's meant for you will find you? What if, instead of speaking over the noise, you simply stayed silent and listened? The question hung in the air, unanswered. But deep down, everyone in the room knew. They were already starting to hear the answer. A heavy silence filled the room, but it wasn't empty. It was the kind of silence that carried weight, the kind that made people reflect, question, and rethink everything they had assumed. Simon let it stretch, knowing that sometimes the most powerful moments happened when nothing was said at all. He could see it in their faces, the internal struggle, the battle between what they had always believed and the possibility of something different. Some still looked uncertain, like they weren't sure whether to trust what he was saying. Others seemed almost relieved, as if they had been waiting for someone to tell them that they didn't have to keep fighting so hard. But then there were those who looked conflicted, the ones who had spent years pushing, speaking, proving. What did it mean for them if silence held more power than noise? Simon took a slow step forward, his voice steady. I know what some of you might be thinking. If I stop speaking up, if I stop pushing, won't I be overlooked? Won't I be left behind, while others take the opportunities I let pass? He let the question hang in the air, watching as a few people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. That's the fear, isn't it? That if we aren't loud enough, visible enough, aggressive enough, we'll disappear. His gaze landed on a man sitting near the back, his arms crossed, his expression skeptical. Simon could tell he was the type who had spent his life making things happen, someone who believed that success. Simon let his words settle, watching as the man in the back shifted slightly, his arms still crossed but his eyes locked onto him. There was something unspoken in his expression, something that told Simon he wasn't just skeptical, he was resisting. Maybe because he had spent his entire life believing the opposite. Maybe because slowing down, letting go, and trusting silence felt like too big of a risk. But Simon wasn't done yet. He took a step forward, lowering his voice slightly, forcing the room to lean in. "Let me ask you this," he said. "How many times have you spoken just to fill the silence? How many times have you forced a decision, pushed for an outcome, only to realize later that it wasn't right? How many times have you chased something so hard that, when you finally got it, it didn't even feel like it was yours?" A few people glanced at each other, the weight of his words pressing down on them. There was a kind of truth in what he was saying that no one could ignore, because they had all been there. Then, you move with it. It carries you forward naturally. He paused, letting there. A man in the back exhaled sharply, as if something had just hit him deep. You can wait in silence all you want, but if you're still focused on something that was never meant for you, it won't come. Not because you failed, not because you weren't good enough, but because something better, something you're meant for, is waiting just outside of your vision. And until you stop looking in the wrong direction, you won't see it. The room felt different now. The kind of quiet that wasn't empty, but full. Full of thoughts, full of realizations, full of a truth people weren't sure they were ready for but needed to hear. Simon let out a small smile, his voice softer now. "So maybe the real question isn't whether you should chase or wait. Maybe the real question is, are you sure you're looking at the right thing?" And with that, he stepped back. The silence that followed wasn't just acceptance, it was transformation. A deep stillness filled the room, but this time, it wasn't the silence of uncertainty or discomfort. It was the silence of understanding. People weren't just listening anymore. They were absorbing, reflecting, letting the weight of Simon's words settle into the parts of them they rarely allowed themselves to explore. Simon let his gaze move slowly across the audience, meeting their eyes one by one. He could see it, the quiet shift happening within them. Some nodded slightly, as if they had just unlocked something they had been searching for. Others sat still, lost in thought, realizing that the answers they had been chasing had been with them all along, just hidden beneath the noise. Then, after what felt like the perfect stretch of silence, Simon took a slow breath and spoke again. "The hardest thing about all of this," he said, his voice softer now, "is trusting that the right things will find you when you stop forcing them. It's not easy. It takes patience. It takes faith. And it takes a kind of strength most people don't talk about. The strength to wait, to trust, and to let go of the need to control everything." A woman in the front row wiped her eyes, nodding to herself. She wasn't alone. Simon had seen this before, the moment when people realized they had been holding on too tightly, gripping life with clenched fists instead of open hands. He had been there too, once. He knew what it felt like to fight for something so hard that he lost sight of why he wanted it in the first place. He took a step forward, grounding himself in the truth of his own experiences. "I'm not telling you to sit back and do nothing," he continued. "I'm not saying that success, love, or fulfillment will magically appear if you wait long enough. What I'm saying is that when you align yourself with what truly matters, when you stop running in the wrong direction, what's meant for you will come in ways you never expected." A man near the back, the same one who had crossed his arms in resistance earlier, now sat leaning forward, elbows on his knees, his expression thoughtful. He had spent his whole life believing that he had to push, to fight, to never stop moving. And yet, here he was, sitting still, realizing that maybe he had been running in circles all along. We'll get what we want, but real success, the kind that feels right, the kind that lasts, isn't about chasing. It's about becoming. Becoming the kind of person who naturally attracts the right opportunities, the right people, the right life. A deep breath moved through the room, like a collective exhale of people finally letting go of something they had been carrying for too long. Simon glanced at the clock, knowing his time was almost up. He could leave them with strategies, with action steps, with a list of things to do, but that wasn't the point. They didn't need more noise. They needed space. Space to reflect, space to feel, space to shift in their own way, at their own pace. So instead, he took one last look at them, let the moment settle, and then said, "Whatever it is you're waiting for, whatever it is you think you need to chase, pause for a moment. Look around, breathe, and ask yourself, am I holding on too tightly? Am I looking in the wrong direction? He let a small smile form, because sometimes the moment you stop searching so desperately is the moment you finally see what's been there all along. With that, he took a step back. The room remained silent, but this time, it was a silence filled with something powerful, a silence that meant something had changed, a silence that meant they were ready to see the world and themselves differently. And that Simon knew was the real beginning.